enough. You're cool.
Are you ready to start?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. We're on performance-based contracting. Everything's in EDGE now, so you can look at the 4 slides either way. I want to talk about performance-based contracting because this is the new, I say new, relatively new, push that the government's trying to use with regard to contracting because they're trying to shift risk from themselves to contractors. So in performance-based contracting, if you recall, the way we used to do things in the old days was we used to have RFP documents that said contractor shall do this, contractor shall do that, and it was very, the government was taking responsibility for writing all the requirements. And when the government or any contracting party takes responsibility for writing all the requirements, they're called the drafter of the contract. When they're the drafter of the contract, any errors or omissions are their fault. So what the government was finding is if they wrote the requirements to the best of their ability, and you did exactly what they asked for, if it didn't meet their intended requirements, they were then held accountable and responsible financially for fixing them. So let's take an example. We talked about we have to put lights in this room. A government RFP statement of work traditionally would have said things like, you need these fluorescent lights, they need to be spaced, oh look at that, every middle one's out. Oh, okay. So they would say that you have to have 3 rows of fluorescent lights, they have to be 2 feet by 6 feet, and they have to be spaced X number of feet apart. So contractor shall do all those things. And so when they would do something like that, if we all came in and it wasn't enough light in this room for us to be able to work, the government, that would be the government's responsibility, because as contractors, if we did it exactly the way they asked, we have done our part in this. If the government's requirements were wrong, then that's their issue. So let's think about this for a second. Remember way, way, way back, we talked about make or buy decision. And the make or buy decision, the government had to decide, what was the make or buy decision?
The government would look at something and says, is it cheaper for me to make it or to buy it?
Right.
The analysis.
Do we have internal resources to be able to do this? Or do we need external resources? So everything we've talked about in this class has been when they need external resources, because that's us. So if you think about it, if the government has already said, we've done our make or buy decision and we can't do this, and now we're saying to those same people, okay, well, you can't do the work, but can you write the requirements? They may or may not be able to do that as well either, right? Because they just don't have those internal resources to dedicate to this project at this point. So what happened was they were taking on more and more responsibility and more financial costs because contractors were doing exactly what they asked for and it still wasn't meeting requirements. So they moved to a risk mitigation strategy, which was put all the risk on contractors. And that's called performance-based contracting. So performance-based contracting means they will tell you the standard that you have to meet, and they don't care how you meet it. So they'll say something like, we need X number of lumens in this room, 100 lumens in this room, and anytime they walk in this room with a light meter, they would check to see if there was 100 lumens. If there was 100 lumens, wonderful, life is good. If there weren't 100 lumens, it's now our responsibility as contractors to make sure that it has 100 lumens. So when they made that shift, they had to restructure the way they did the RFP. So instead of a statement of work with the thou shalts all over the place, we now have performance-based, they're called performance work statements, and that's what's used for performance-based contracting. So in a performance work statement, they will tell us what the standard is we have to meet. So in this case, 100 lumens. And then they pretty much give us a blank sheet. And if you want to put in these kind of lights, that's great. If you want to do sunlight, get natural light in, great. If you want to do little globe lights, mood lighting, whatever you want in terms of lighting, as long as you produce 100 lumens, you're good to go. If they come in and you're not at 100 lumens, now you're the drafter of the contract, which means you're obligated to pay to fix it to 100 lumens. Everybody with me? Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So a couple of things about performance-based acquisition. It basically means an acquisition that's structured around results. So they're telling you exactly what standards you have to meet, and you do that. It has to have several components. It's got to have, be able to describe the requirement in terms of measurable outcomes, 100 lumens, rather than in terms of you have to have these things 3 feet apart and spaced, they each have to be 3 feet or 6 feet, and they have to be spaced 9 feet apart. So it's not restricted. They also have some kind of performance standard that has to be met. So what is considered acceptable performance? What do you have to do to meet acceptable performance? So they have to tell you that up front. They also tell you what the procedures are going to be if you don't meet them. So what's the remedy going to be if you don't meet the performance standard that they set? So sometimes they'll put incentives in here. If you meet 100 lumens on a 90-day trial basis, then you're good to go, and it will give you an incentive. So they can put incentive, they can use contracting types to help encourage you to do this. And then there has to be some sort of performance assessment plan. And this is what's known as a QASP, Quality Assurance Surveillance Plan. And normally what they do is the government says, contractors, part of your proposal, give us a QASP. How would you, contractor, like us, the government, to evaluate you? And then they always have final approval on that, but it's basically them shifting their work to you. So you figure out your QASP, you give it to them, they review it, and then that's what becomes part of the contract. Any questions about this? The objectives here, I always like the example of it's a multiple choice test, it's a true-false test versus an essay exam. In a true-false test, which is what the typical statement of work is, you just basically have to say, yes, we'll do this requirement, yes, we'll do this requirement, yes, we'll do this requirement. And if you take exception to anything and you say no, that puts you in, they have to decide whether or not they still want to work with you. So it's just pretty much yes or no to all the requirements. In this one, they tell you what the standard is, and they leave it totally up to you. So you have to write your own solution as to how you're going to meet this requirement. And the government, if they have people who are really knowledgeable about lighting systems, should be able to look at your essay, just like professors can look at essays of students and see whether or not they're writing a cohesive argument or whether they're trying to BS them, right? So the government gets a real quick thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether or not you know what you're talking about based on what your solution is and the details that you're providing. It's also trying to maximize competition. So you know yourselves, if you work with a contractor coming into your home, say you want to do a bathroom renovation, and you have sort of in your mind what you'd like to see, and then you say to the contractor, if this was your, and he or she gives you a phenomenal price, because it's always a phenomenal price, right? And then you say, hey, if this was your bathroom, what would you do? And all of a sudden you notice the numbers come to a screeching halt, right? They tend to come down quite a bit because now you're asking them what's the most cost-effective way to get these objectives met. That's what the government's trying to do with performance-based contracting. So they want you to use, you do this stuff day in and day out. You put lights in every day to all different kinds of facilities. You know what are the good light manufacturers versus the not good ones, the effective ones versus the not effective. You know who's you're going to have problems with, or the customer's going to have problems. So you would cut all those out and you would give them the best possible solution you could come up with. It also allows them to encourage and promote the use of commercial services, since what they're asking you is, what do you typically do commercially? That's what we want here in the government. We're not going to impose our stringent requirements on you because maybe this isn't the best lighting configuration. So you tell us what it is. Shifts the risk, as we talked about. And it should also achieve savings because, again, you're not going to, this kind of solution might be expensive to put in, and you can come up with something much more cost effective. So those are the objectives. So when we talk about performance standards, they could come up with response times, delivery times, any kind of meeting deadlines could be one standard. They could do something around error rates, how many errors are considered acceptable, accuracy rates in terms of percentages, how accurate does the data have to be, completion milestone, when things are going to get done by a certain date, and then cost control, trying to make sure that you do these things within certain cost parameters. The incentives that they can use are several. They can do cost-based incentives where they're trying to tie profit or fee based on whether or not you meet certain cost objectives. So if you come in below, $150,000, we'll give you a 10% incentive. Award fee, where they use evaluation factors to determine whether or not, to come up with this award fee plan. And then when they come up with an award fee plan, typically what they say is, we're going to take the year and we're going to break it up into quarters. And at the first quarter, we're going to come in and we're going to see if you met the standard. And if you did, we're going to give you X number of dollars from that award fee plan. And then we come in the second month and oops, you didn't make it that month. Well, you've lost the opportunity to earn that part of the award fee. Third quarter comes on, oh, you've met it again? Okay, now you get the third quarter. So it's not cumulative. Every quarter you have to meet the objectives in order to get the money. If you don't meet the objective that quarter, you don't get the money and you don't have any chance of recouping that money. So it impacts your profit margin. They can also do things around schedule. So if you beat the delivery schedule, they can have some schedule incentives. So, the contract requires you to deliver within 30 days. If you can deliver within 15 days, we'll give you a 5% incentive. And then past performance, they can use, depending on how well you do on this performance-based contract, they're going to give you I'm going to rephrase. On every contract, they evaluate your past performance. So if you do well on this performance-based, you go into their database as having done well on a performance-based contract, which would encourage other agencies to look favorably at you if you do well. Okay. Any questions about performance-based?
I have a comment. When I was at DAU, they talked about maybe the first performance-based contracting, and they talked about the Wilbur and Wilbur Light making the airplane, and they put out a solicitation. We want something that is heavier than air that will fly 10 miles, and so because they didn't know how to make the plane. So anyway,
that's a great example.
One of the first examples.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, we don't know particularly in the Intel world, we don't know how many people actually work for the government. And so, and as we said yesterday, administrations come along and some increase government and some decrease government. And so at any point in time, while we can look at OPM and say, okay, there's X number of people that work at Department of Energy, we really can't do that in the Intel space. So when it comes to, it's a lot easier for the government to come up with a performance-based standard that says, hey, we have to meet 100 lumens, rather than come up with all the detailed requirements. So I think you're going to see more and more of a push towards this performance-based contracting, just because agencies are losing technical expertise. They keep talking about the brain drain. A lot of the baby boomers are all retiring, and so all that knowledge is going out the door, and there are fewer people in government overall, so you've got people wearing multiple hats. And so, there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think you're going to see more and more of this. All right, so I'm going to talk about government financing for a second. As a general rule of thumb, you're supposed to be able to fund your own contracting initiatives. But let's say, for example, I'll use an example. There was, what do we call it? I can't remember it. But there was a contract where we had to put computer systems in every Navy base. It was about an $8 billion contract. And what the government wanted us to do was to put all the computers into a base at our own expense. And then we would, once the system became up and functioning, we would charge a per seat cost for each for each person every month. So the idea was to take on that risk ourselves, put the computers in, and then once it was up and running, then we would get paid a monthly fee. Now, I worked for a global IT company that had 150,000 people, right? And while it probably wasn't the best of financial situations, we could do that, right? We had the collateral with banks to be able to get loans and to be able to do that. But the government understands that if they were to ask one of you as a small business to do that, that's probably not feasible, right? You can't do that. So they have government financing, and they mean it in different ways. So we're just going to talk about this. Most contracts you work on are not going to have any kind of government financing. You know, it's really going to be up to you, but they're not going to have these large requirements like I just mentioned. So they have to use this FAR Part 32 to consider contract financing provisions and clauses. And basically, the reason why they would use it is they're not going to get competition if they don't. So if they had a small business set aside to be able to put computers in all these bases in the Navy, and oh, by the way, you have to install it all yourselves, no small business would step up to that because they just don't have the financial wherewithal to do that. So that's why they would have to do contract financing. So the example of a contractor would not be able to bill for the first delivery of products or performance milestones for a substantial amount of time, normally 6 months or more for a mid to large company, or 4 months or more for a small business concern. So let's say, for example, remember I told you yesterday, when you win the contract, you have your performance, you have your milestones, and you sit down with the government and you figure out how you're getting paid. Are you getting paid per milestone, or is it a firm fixed price where you're just going to bill an equal amount each month? How are you going to get paid for this stuff? Do you guys have a crisis going on over there?
Yeah.
Do you?
Pretty much.
If you need to step out for it. No, it's hard to kind of. My phone keeps giving me 1,000 texts, so I think I have one too, but I'm just going to ignore it for the time being. So if you as a small business can't bill for at least 4 months for something, so let's say, for example, you guys agree to your milestones and you have to implement something and it's 6 months out. In that case, as a small business, you could say, hey, we can't swing having this not be billable for that period of time, and you can work out something with the government where they would actually give you some of your money ahead of time so that you could actually afford to be able to do this. If otherwise responsible firms are in the market and they're likely to have an actual finance need or not be able to obtain private financing for the work. So, a lot of times when you go for bank loans, you have to explain what you're doing. You know, if you're doing something in an Intel space, maybe you can't tell anybody what you're doing. That would be an example where you might get government financing. So most of what you guys are going to be doing is in the commercial space, except if you're doing fabrication and things like that. That may put you in the non-commercial case. But in non-commercial, contract financing has to be provided in contracts for non-commercial items. And in that case, the contractor has to provide government financing only to the extent actually needed for prompt and efficient performance. So if your whole contract is $10 million, they're not going to give you $10 million off the bat. But they might give you $1 million to get you started. Administer contract financing as to aid, not impede the acquisition. So they're trying to make this as seamless as possible with you so that the contract can proceed as scheduled. They don't want to, have this whole separate process that causes you to not be able to get work done. So that's why if you think you're going to need the money, you want to talk to them about it early. Avoid any undue risk of monetary loss to the government through financing. So they want to make sure you're solvent and that you're going to, if they give you money up front to be able to get contract performance done, in other words, pay you some of your money early as opposed to actually before you complete it, then they have to feel confident that you're going to be able to pay them back, that you're not going to run off with the funds. Make sure it's in the government's best interest to do this, and monitor the contractor's use of contract financing. So they're going to ask you for a little bit more reporting if you're using their money, because they want to make sure that it's being used properly. In commercial contracting, here are the criteria. So for most of you, the contract item financed is a commercial supply or service, so just by virtue of the fact that it's a commercial item, we put it in that category. The contract price exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold, so we talked about that yesterday, so it has to be higher than that amount. The CO determines that contracting and financing is appropriate or customarily done in the commercial marketplace. That would be another reason why they would allow you to get financing. Authorizing this form of